Welcome, summoners. My name is Sam. This is Vision Denial and Road to MSI. This week, G2 qualifies for the actual playoffs, meaning their qualification to MSI feels less bad. Vietnam's whole region is under investigation for match fixing, causing some stirs. Rek'Sai is super interesting. And we get the introduction of the LCK and more today in Road to MSI. Let's get started. First on the bracket, very quickly, if you follow the LEC in any way, shape, or form, this is not surprising to you, but G2, who had already won in their winter split to qualify for MSI, has now gotten into the best of 5 portion of the spring playoffs for their actual playoff run. Not to put a more finer point, I repeated this multiple times as, my dislike and distaste of the current LEC format in multiple different ways. This is where their actual playoff starts. And for many of the teams, in fact, as they're going to be facing off against Fnatic, if I remember that correctly. Yes. And it's just a matter of time before we see if this will be a proper measurement of if they're going to be able to show up and be representatives of the LEC in and of itself. Who knows? Second on the bracket, let's talk about the Rek'Sai pick and its increased relevance. In fact, many of the different picks that are showing up more and more. For starters, in the LCK as they have started, they're in 14.6, so the global ban is no longer global for Azir, who now has the opportunity to be shown in play. And it's underwhelming so far. There's not been enough best of 5 so far to generate any kind of speculation on his impact, so to speak, but it seems like business as usual with an Azir. Azir's been in the game for so long. His influence on the meta is very minimal. He comes back because he's bringing enough power for neutral fights, so on and so forth. That's all well and good. So look forward to a little bit more dynamic approaches to drafts for the other regions as they approach international scene, or for those that have yet to start. That said, Rek'Sai is the super interesting pick and flavor of the playoffs, it seems. Mostly as a way to engage and distance, so to speak, from drain tanks and other tanks who usually tend to scale easily and automatically no matter what. And this puts a lot of a timer, a pressure for early game approaches, which I enjoy, quite frankly. I do think that the laning phase interaction must feel very unfun, for at least from a top-down perspective of the consistent ability to just trade, heal, return, trade, heal, return. It's a la old Ornn, who was able to just get items in lane and be able to consistently harass with almost no counterplay. But it allows probably a better thought process of what to choose for the top side of the map, other than your Renekton's, your Cassantes, the ability to just get, oh hi, we're going to get a meatball who can do damage both early and late game, but it is just going to be no thought to it. At least with the Rek'Sai pick, it feels like there is a proper amount of thought. Not just in lane, but in terms of the interaction against their opponent's jungler. It's quite a fun time, at least to me. I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of the interactions with the Rek'Sai in top lane, who also is able to double as a pressure for the jungle. Next up, we have Vietnam under complete disarray. They're finally getting their playoff time to start. That being, for those who want to follow live, their spring playoffs start on the 3rd, so 2 days from the day that I'm recording this, which I started recording this on April 1st, 7 minutes before midnight. But they're starting April 3rd. at least April 3rd in terms of Eastern time. That should still be, it's April 3rd everywhere for them. The reason why it's in disarray and they are starting much, much later than anticipated was because of the match fixing investigation. I will put a link down below regarding the kerfuffle that is all this. But let me get you the rundown of the situation. Now, and I'm reading this mostly verbatim from the Wikipedia, who has a treasure trove of the situation. This implicates every single team, every single one, all right? On March 15th, the VCS, or the Vietnamese Championship Series organizers, had ordered to postpone some matches of the 2024 Spring Split to conduct an investigation of the teams participating in the VCS. And after said investigation, the VCS announced that all matches will be postponed from March 18th with the following details. That all remaining matches of the group stages will be canceled. Results of March 14th will not be counted. The VCS Spring Finals will also be postponed. The group stage rankings will be calculated based on the results of the end of week 7, so March 10th, and this ranking will also be used to decide the teams participating in the playoffs. The Vietnamese esports news site, the iththao.vn, because I don't know what that specifically is supposed to say. Again, I will link below my source here. Also published an exclusive article with few players competing at the VCS 2024 Spring who were summoned by Riot to give testimony. According to the anonymous player, the site had informed that all 8 teams were summoned by Riot to VCS Studio to serve the investigation match fixing. Every single team was implicated here. This is crazy. All right. The results of this process. On the 28th of March, the VCS announced that it would postpone competition, direction, and training for 32 individuals and players indefinitely for the investigation purposes. And on March 29th, they announced that MGN Blue Esports and Cerberus Esports withdrew because there's too many of those members of their teams and staff that were suspended indefinitely after the investigation. Therefore, the number of teams in the playoffs would have been reduced from 6 teams, which would have had a fairly similar bracket to many of the other regions, to 4 teams for the entire playoff. Oh my God. 32 people. Now, notably, some of these are either newer players or have not had such a huge impact, but many of these teams have just opted to completely give up their players or will cooperate completely. The only team that has not done so is Team Secret for some reason, for Eddie and Chiang. But names that are super relevant. You got Ryuk, Froggy, Zodiac, Glory, Bean J. This is a number of implication and involvement that is wild to me. And feels incredibly bad, primarily because, oh my God, primarily because we had spoken previously in some of the past videos about the smaller regions compared to the major regions being absorbed slightly. And Vietnam was unique because this was a region that was birthed from the LMS, the PCS's previous form, or their predecessor. Having had so many teams from their region playing so well, they were given the ability and funding to have their own region. This might be the nail in the coffin for their ability to actually continue as such going forward in the coming years. We'll see how well they recover, but 32 people is a crazy amount of people to just lose. And that means that, again, 2 of these teams had to go completely from the playoffs, and full rosters of teams who had not qualified for the playoffs but are gone. Team Rainbow's complete players are out, just completely. They're suspended until further notice. Players like Killer and Artifact, who are notable here, it feels bad. Very few teams were left kinda unscathed. Teams specifically like Team Secret, who again did not say they would fully cooperate with the organization publicly, but have enough players to keep up with the process. GAM esports who have the process, and their players didn't seem to be major like focuses of the main roster. This is, I don't know. I feel like this is going to be rough in general for the Vietnamese scene. But we'll get to see. They've bounced back from the COVID issues to now. It'll just be a matter of getting to see a new generation of players possibly, or whether or not they get absorbed. It will be up to the future. We have yet to see. They still got playoffs to go. We'll still be seeing a Vietnamese team at MSI. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the crazy things happening there. Up next, we are going to explore the playoffs that I haven't been able to review. Now, if you have not seen some of the ones on my TikTok, I will leave down below as I watch them live. It is not possible for me to watch them all live, so now we are coming to a point where everything is busy and stacking up. It is go time for many of these regions. So we'll be reviewing and covering the matches of March 26th all the way to March 31st, specifically up till the PCS's Fukuoka SoftBank Hawks Gaming versus Frank Esports. After that, so the LPL's initial and inaugural spring split series and forward, I will have not been able to cover at the time of this recording. So without further ado, let's take a look. Vision plays such a huge factor in these series. There's an acknowledgement that the issues that plagued these teams the last time they faced have largely been resolved in some way, shape, or form. From both sides holding better vision that is a little bit more consistent, neutrals that are better approached, adaptation from game to game and in drafts that are even stronger. That said, Isidus have a little tendency to be a little bit over aggressive, coupled with an inconsistency to find proactive leads, relying primarily on the mistakes from Rainbow Seven. It's just not great. Once a lead is garnered, however, they are fantastic and balloon excellently, but up until that point, this is a very passive team. Meanwhile, the inconsistent play from Rainbow Seven is now replaced with a defeated team if they fall behind by 2 to 3K. Hopefully, that gets resolved before the finals because the ways in which they played with vision is solid. Their neutrals were near perfect, and the map play was top notch. Now, hopefully, they chill out with how aggressively they pushed and are forced to course correct via team fighting before the grand finals and another rematch they have to go through. My MVP for the series is Seo. He was just playing out of his mind, flashing into Isidus to get kills. This was the lower bracket finals and the first rematch. Isidus versus movie star R7, Rainbow Seven. Poor adaptations and passivity will get you every time. Now, Beyond Gaming holds some of the worst drafting choices I've seen so far in spring of 2024. But sometimes that isn't usually an issue if you understand your win conditions and are able to adapt, which they couldn't either in game or through draft. Now, I will give them their vision was more consistent than that of Frank's, but it wasn't ever really used to garner anything, to push advantages, to push anything. The one win that they got had more to do with Frank's inability of, and just to get to Frank, their passivity is not much better. They have stronger team fighting and neutral approaches that aren't helped when they're mostly approaching these things from the position of catching unforced errors. Now, hopefully, Frank can show some stronger proactive play as we move forward, but the spotty vision on top of the passivity does not help their case. My MVP for the series is Kaiwing for how much he controlled, he just held during these team fights. This was round 2 in the lower bracket of the PCS, Megabank Beyond Gaming versus Frank Esports. Quite honestly, either team could have won this series and I would have been okay with the result. Don't let the actual champion diversity fool you here. Deep Cross's flexibility is a byproduct of the really bad read they had on the Hawks' entire series. They played with great tempo and pressure and great proactivity, but failed to understand what made their drafts work, their win conditions, or even that of the Hawks to counter the plays consistently. As a result, we had a very coin-flippy deep cross that it'd be hard to see if they would stick the landing. The Hawks, for their part, continue, waiting and looking for their opponents to make a mistake before anything else. They have some solid understanding of neutral setups and some solid vision play, but passive play that leads to games that play for way too long. I would love to see them pull off a miracle and usurp the PCS to become their representatives, but given how passive and slow they play, it's not likely to happen. It barely happened here. My MVP of the series is Lee Sin. The team that picked him would win. No, in all honesty, it's Levy for the amount of pressure he absorbed and controlled. Poor Kwangdong. Solid early game, just no coordination to speak of. One-sided affairs can be rough to analyze, but this is really more about the story of how Hanwha Life are inconsistent in the early game and some rough patches around. Because Kwangdong have serviceable vision play, some good understanding of their win conditions, and neutral setups. In fact, 2 out of 3 of these games, they held such strong early leads that it was kind of hard to see how they would lose them. Hanwha Life, for their part, are just a stronger, more coordinated teams, allowing moments where 2K deficits turn into 2K leads in a matter of minutes. Once the control is held by Hanwha Life, they play incredibly well, just serviceably around the map, solid vision, full understanding of neutrals, staring at Kwangdong saying, everything that you can do, I can do better. All resulting in such a strong Game 3 where they can actually play the early game as well. Honestly, Hanwha Life do need to be careful. So much of this series almost fumbled from risky positioning over aggressive plays and downright some passive moments that stronger teams will fully punish. Just like Kwangdong show us that they aren't a stronger team, just a serviceable one. My MVP of this series is Zeka for how much he controlled the team fights in this series. This was round 1 of the LCK, Kwangdong Freaks versus Hanwha Life Esports. This was not the result that I expected. From everything that we had seen before from the Flying Oysters, it seemed like they would have the edge in this series. But instead, what we saw was a team who was very confused by the abilities of their opponents. Now, the Flying Oysters' vision play, neutral setup, and much of their early game approach was pretty good. But the Talons decided to just really lean into the pressure that they applied. No warm-up games, they fixed that problem from their previous series, hit solid early game tempo control, beautiful neutral setups, and the coordination. Mwah. Now, I do have some qualms about how much they force the plays, but that may have more to do with the consistency in which their coordination was present, with some vision play issues that I do need cleaning up. I think the Flying Oysters have a chance to regroup for potential revenge, but quite honestly, if this is the Talons that we will continue to get, then it won't surprise me if they become the representatives. It'll just be a matter of adaptation between now and then. My MVP for the series is Junja for how much of the early game he controlled for his team. This was the upper bracket finals, CTBC Flying Oysters versus Paris Saint-Germain Talon Esports. Coin flips are what these games really were. Both teams held very similar approaches to vision, skirmishes, neutrals, and adaptation, mostly fairly inconsistent. Not while VCS had a more top side of the map approach to their play and paying a bot side approach, I found myself mostly guessing who was going to win any given game. Mostly as both teams overforce, overchase, be too far up, and are really over-focusing skirmishing over map play, especially when drafting, they would pick more intricate options and never play to them. Both of these teams would be easy picking in an international setting given this particular setup, as fighting and skill checking was the bulk of what was offered and not much more. And don't get me wrong, the coordination from these teams and their target selection is rather incredible. All of the fights were fun, dynamic, and skillful. But the when fights happen and how much was dedicated to these fights is something I hope gets reevaluated before their next series. My MVP of this series is Kuri for how much space he created and how well he enabled his team's success. This was the CBLOL's upper bracket round 2, VCS Stars versus Pain Gaming. Congrats to Team Liquid on being the third team to qualify for MSI. Now, Cloud9 had solid vision play, good neutral setup, solid coordination, and yet zero adaptations to the series, or what seemed to be any adaptation within the games themselves. Hopefully, that gets resolved for the next split because it was frustrating to watch this team bash their head on a wall. Now, Team Liquid, for their part, have really impressed me, from properly understanding how to close out games, ballooning leads properly, and upkeeping pressure, neutrals that have purpose to them and not just an autopiloted team. God, the Team Liquid of old are for sure gone. Now, even with the vision and coordination supplemented with the tempo that they play at, I do have a slight concern at some of the more ambitious and risky skirmishes that were approached this series. But at this moment, I think they'll do just fine in international play. My MVP for this series is Impact for so much of his invisible and yet huge influence that he had on the map and the various skirmishes. This was the lower bracket finals of the LCS, Cloud9 versus Team Liquid Honda. Chaos and confusion abound. Both of these teams need to get their shit together. Something to applaud from KT, there is a decent amount of adaptation happening game to game. Some solid vision play and great coordination, but the games themselves, there is so much hesitation and uncertainty that makes any contest or approach very simple to have from their opponents. Now that said, when the team is locked in, it's graceful and looks like an unstoppable team. But in this series, they were mostly a coin flip. D+, for their part, are not much better. In the same vein as KT, D+ hold great vision and coordination, and when everything is in control, it's great. And for D+, control looks incredible even. Like solid calculation instead of pure dominance. A team worthy of international play even. But it's just so inconsistent and unreliable that I couldn't ever see either of the team really succeeding in international play that way. We'll just have to see for D+. My MVP of this series is Lucid for the amount of pressure and control he applied in the early game. This was round 1 of the LCK. We got KT Rollsters versus D+ Kia. I will not be surprised if the Hawks make it the distance and just fumbles at the last moment. Frank had a lot of solid aspects going for them. Some strong early game vision, decent coordination, understanding of their opponent's win condition, but never their own win conditions, mostly opting to wait for their opponents to fumble on any skirmish or macro play to really get things moving. And against the Hawks, that worked for a bit, but the consistency is what's needed for these kinds of best of fives. It just wasn't there. Now, the Hawks, for their part, do understand their own win conditions and that of their opponents, some solid coordination, and still showing some very overall solid standard of play. But they can't seem to nail down how to close out their games. Because, frankly, these games last way too long with the leads that either team, but specifically that the Hawks would accrue only for them to be lost or barely a win. This has to be corrected soon or will bite them in the end, especially going up against the Flying Oysters. My MVP of the series is Marble, who continued to play solid skirmishing throughout the series. This was the PCS's round 3 lower bracket. Frank Esports versus Fukuoka SoftBank Hawks Gaming. This was super interesting. As an overall situation and love of everything that is happening within the scenes, there is some indication and concerns that some of these teams have not been able to properly establish ways to close out games. That there's improvement. There's clear improvement that many of these teams are showing the ability to move forward. In fact, the Brazilian League and the LCK have great moments where they're just like pushing forward and closing games nicely, but not every single team that I've been playing so far within these leagues. And then we have situations like in the PCS with the Hawks, who can't close games very well at all. that is supplemented also with some very interesting drafting choices. I feel like the stylistic options and mind games and adaptations are starting to become better and more layered. Things that have been pushing away from, except for again for the PCS, but away from Smolders, especially with like seeing the 14.6 patch in the LCK. There is a wealth and treasure trove of future possibilities from watching a lot of these teams play within like added regions. That is giving me a little bit more aspirations to the fun that will be coming in at MSI. At least that's from the series so far that I have watched. A lot more of the competitions is coming in. The Vietnamese League is going to be starting soon. Hopefully with some delight. I have yet to start the LPL, but the LPL is always a fun time to behold. Usually, again, things change over time. And the LEC is also going to be starting off their bout of their best of fives soon as well. We will be having no teams left to go. And it will be just a matter of the teams who have only one game or a couple of games left, or one series or a couple of series left for their finals. And we'll be getting a nice image of what's to come. But at least that's from my observations. Not a whole lot outside of the drama and interesting drafting situations and setups. But that is what it is. I would like to hear what you have to think. Again, I'd love to hear all your thoughts down below. I appreciate everybody who watches. It is greatly appreciated. And I hope that all of you have a wonderful time. I will see you all next week. I apologize for the delay with this. There has been some hiccups across the board. But without further ado, have a wonderful time, and I'll see you then.